In the stillness of the African bush, danger doesn't roar, it waits. Hidden in the tall grass of Zimbabwe's Hwange National Park, something moves. Something massive. Something ancient. They call it the Black Death. Not a disease, not a storm, but a beast with horns like scythes and the power of a freight train, the Cape Buffalo. Nearly a ton of muscle, speed, and fury capable of killing a man in seconds. Hunters whisper its name with respect, and sometimes with fear, because this is the one animal in Africa said to hunt you back. And on one blistering afternoon, a man who thought he was in control stepped into that wild arena and never walked out alive. His name was Richard Hale, British, wealthy, bold. To some, he was a fearless adventurer, chasing legacy. To others, he was reckless, arrogant, a man daring nature to prove him wrong. But on that day, in the dust and thorns of Hwange, the line between hunter and hunted shattered. The buffalo didn't run, didn't retreat. It waited, it watched, and when the moment came, it struck with terrifying precision. What really happened in those final seconds? Why did the animal attack with such force? And why does this single death still ignite anger, outrage, and debate? This isn't just a story about a hunt gone wrong. It's about risk, power, and the chilling truth that in Africa, the wild decides who leaves alive. And so, we ask the question that haunts every safari, every rifle raised at the edge of the bush. When the hunter becomes the hunted, who truly walks away? To understand what unfolded that evening in Hwange, we first need to understand the man who walked into the bush, Richard Hale. Richard wasn't an ordinary tourist. He wasn't the type to sit safely in a game vehicle with binoculars and a guide pointing out elephants. No, Richard came to Africa for something else. Danger, conquest, and the kind of stories you can't buy, only survive. At 47 years old, Hale had already lived a life most people would call bold. Born into wealth in the English countryside, he grew up with access to sprawling estates, horses, and rifles. Adventure wasn't just a hobby for him, it was an identity. By the time he hit his 20s, he had turned that identity into a persona, the fearless big game hunter. His Instagram, his interviews, his stories at private clubs, they all painted the picture of a man who laughed in the face of risk. But here's the thing about identity. Sometimes the mask we wear in public becomes the trap we can't take off. For Richard, fearlessness wasn't just an image, it was an expectation. He had to live up to it. He had to prove he was the man who stared danger in the face and came out on top. That drive made him magnetic to some and unbearable to others. Supporters admired his boldness, his willingness to go where others hesitated. Critics saw arrogance, a man poking the wild until it snapped back. And yet, beneath the arguments and headlines, there was something far more human. A father. Richard had a son in his early 20s, studying in London. Their relationship wasn't simple. His son didn't share his obsession with hunting or his hunger for legacy. In fact, he often questioned it. But Richard carried this belief. If he left behind a legend, a name remembered for bravery, for conquest, then maybe his son would see him differently. It's here where you, the viewer, might feel the pull. Because we all carry that quiet pressure. To be seen as more than ordinary, to prove ourselves, to leave something behind. Richard's way of chasing that legacy was extreme, yes, but maybe you felt the same itch. To go further, risk more, to prove something not just to the world, but to yourself. And that's where danger creeps in. Because when your identity is tied to proving fearlessness, fear itself becomes forbidden. You can't back down. You can't pause. You can't say no. Richard Hale was a man shaped by that drive. By all accounts, he was charming, confident, larger than life. But he was also walking a razor's edge, one where each step into the wild carried the possibility of no return. When he landed in Zimbabwe, he wasn't just booking another safari. He was chasing another chapter in his legend. And somewhere out there, in the thorns and tall grass, a Cape buffalo was waiting to test whether that legend would live or end. Africa isn't just a place on a map. It's an arena, a stage where the rules you live by back home don't apply, where comfort and control vanish the moment you step out of the truck. And for Richard Hale, the arena he entered was Zimbabwe's Hwange National Park. Picture it, 40,000 square miles of unforgiving bushland. Mopane trees stretch across the horizon, their leaves shimmering like coins under the merciless sun. Dust hangs in the air, thick, clinging to skin and clothes. The ground cracks under the weight of heat, and every shadow looks alive. To outsiders, it's breathtaking. To locals, it's home. But to hunters, Hwange is a crucible. This land is where reputations are built and destroyed. It's not like the managed reserves or fenced ranches where animals are predictable, almost domesticated. Here, the wilderness breathes with raw unpredictability. Elephants crush paths through thickets. Lions vanish into tall grass, unseen until it's too late. And then there's the Cape buffalo, the one animal hunters whisper about when the fire burns low. They call it the Black Death. Nearly 2,000 pounds of muscle and fury wrapped in a hide thick enough to shrug off bullets. But its size isn't what makes it feared. It's the mind. Unlike predators that strike for food, the buffalo attacks for reasons humans struggle to understand. Some call it revenge. Others say instinct. Guides tell stories of buffalo doubling back, circling hunters who thought they were safe, waiting for the perfect moment to charge. Here's the contrast. In the West, danger often feels distant. Your daily battles might be deadlines, traffic, relationships. In Hwange, danger isn't symbolic. It's alive, breathing, watching. A single step in the wrong direction can turn the hunter into prey. And that reality doesn't negotiate. For Richard Hale, Hwange wasn't just wilderness. It was a proving ground. This was the stage where he believed legends were made, where he could add another triumph to his growing list of conquests. His guides warned him, "The buffalo here, they don't forgive mistakes. But when your identity is built on defying fear, warnings feel like challenges." And maybe that's what the buffalo sensed. The confidence, the intrusion, the arrogance of a man who thought the wild could be mastered. Because in Hwange, the land itself takes sides. Tests you. It decides if you're worthy to leave. So as Richard stepped deeper into the thorn scrub, rifle in hand, the stage was already set. The heat, the silence, the unseen eyes in the brush. All of it building toward a moment where nature would remind him, and the world, who really controls the outcome. The hunt began under a sky that burned white with heat. Richard Hale, flanked by his professional guide and 2 local trackers, stepped off the safety of the trail and into the thick bush. The sound of cicadas rose like static, and every step through the thorn scrub snapped with tension. This was the moment Richard lived for. The pursuit, the silence before the storm. The trackers found the print's first broad, deep impressions pressed into the dry earth. Cape buffalo. A bull. And judging by the spacing and depth, a giant one. The kind hunters brag about for years. The kind that photographs and mounts can't capture because it's not just size. It's myth. But something felt off. The prints didn't veer far. The bull wasn't moving as fast or as far as expected. Normally, buffalo scatter at the first hint of pursuit, disappearing into the brush with raw power. This one lingered, almost as if it wanted to be followed. Richard brushed off the concern. He had heard the warnings before. Buffalo will trick you. Buffalo will circle back. But to him, those were campfire exaggerations, designed to make the bush seem more mystical than it really was. In his eyes, it was simple: an animal runs, a hunter follows. End of story. And yet, the silence felt heavy. The trackers exchanged glances, uneasy. At one point, they stopped, pointing to where the tracks suddenly paused beneath a mopane tree. The earth was gouged, disturbed, as if the bull had stood there for a while, watching, waiting. Richard chuckled, slapping his rifle stock. Superstition, he muttered. To him, fear was weakness. To his guides, though, it was survival. They had seen buffalo double back, launching ambushes from impossible angles. They had buried hunters who underestimated how calculated these creatures could be. The trail wound deeper into the bush, thorns clawing at clothes, shadows shifting with every gust of wind. At times, the men swore they could hear something heavy moving just beyond sight. But when they stopped, the world went still. It was the kind of silence that isn't peace, but pressure, like a held breath waiting to explode. Richard ignored it. He pressed forward, confident, chasing the thrill. To him, this wasn't just a hunt. It was validation. Proof that he was still the man who stared into the wild and didn't blink. Proof that legends weren't accidents. They were earned through boldness. But what he couldn't see, what none of them could, was that the balance had already shifted. The buffalo wasn't the one being pursued. It was dictating the terms. When the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in gold and blood orange, the men lost the tracks for a moment. The bush seemed to swallow them whole. And in that uneasy pause, the guide whispered the truth every seasoned hunter knows but few admit aloud. If he's still here, he's waiting for us. The hunt wasn't about pursuit anymore. It was about survival. Richard didn't realize it yet, but in Hwange, the first encounter isn't always the first sighting. Sometimes, it's the moment when you step onto someone else's battlefield. And on that day, the battlefield belonged to the buffalo. The sun was dropping, turning the bush into long shadows and half-seen shapes. This is the most dangerous hour in Hwange. Not full day, not full night, but something in between, when every sound feels amplified and every silence feels loaded. Richard and his party moved cautiously along a dry riverbed. The tracks had returned, fresh and heavy, leading toward a waterhole choked with reeds. The buffalo was close, too close. The air itself felt different, thicker, like the bush was holding its breath. Then it happened. From nowhere, a blur of muscle erupted from the brush. No warning snort, no thunder of hooves in the distance. Just an explosion of fury at point-blank range. The buffalo came out low, silent until the final moment, horns gleaming in the dying light. For a split second, Richard froze. Even seasoned hunters admit it. The charge of a buffalo is not something the human brain can process in time. It's too fast, too final. Nearly a ton of rage closing the distance in under 3 seconds. "Shoot!" his guide yelled. Richard raised his rifle, but the angle was wrong, the distance too short. He fired. The shot cracked, dust and gunpowder filling the air. But the bull didn't stop. If anything, it seemed to grow faster, more determined, as though the bullet had only confirmed its purpose. And then impact. Witnesses say the horns hit with a sound like a tree splitting in a storm. The force lifted Richard off the ground, tossing him like a rag doll. The buffalo didn't just gore. It drove, ramming again and again, slamming him into the dirt. The earth shook with each blow. His screams were lost beneath the guttural bellows of the beast. The trackers shouted, firing in desperation, trying to drive it away. But Cape buffalo aren't like other animals. They don't strike once and retreat. They punish. They make sure. The bull trampled, stomped, and gored, its horns tearing through flesh, its eyes wild with a rage that seemed almost personal. And then, as suddenly as it had come, it stopped. Standing over the broken body, sides heaving, the buffalo snorted, flung blood from its horns, and vanished back into the bush. Silence returned, heavier than before. When the dust settled, Richard lay motionless, his rifle shattered, his body broken in ways too brutal to describe. For all his wealth, his bravado, his cultivated legend, in those last seconds he was just a man against the wild. And the wild had won. The guides approached carefully, shaken. One would later say, "It wasn't an attack, it was an execution." And maybe that's why the Cape buffalo is feared above all. Because when it strikes, it doesn't feel random. Feels chosen. Richard Hale had come to Africa to add another trophy to his story. Instead, the wild wrote its own ending. A reminder, carved in blood and silence, that here, no hunter is untouchable. When the dust of the charge finally settled, there was no triumph, no trophy, no victory picture. Only silence. A silence so heavy it seemed to press on the chest of everyone at the scene. The trackers stood frozen. The guide clutched his rifle, hands trembling. No one spoke because what words could capture what they had just witnessed? Richard Hale was gone. The man who had once strode into the bush with the confidence of a conqueror now lay broken. His story ended not with applause, but with horror. Back at camp, word spread like wildfire. Whispers carried faster than the wind. Staff looked away, eyes lowered, avoiding questions they weren't allowed to answer. Phones buzzed, radios crackled, and by nightfall, the tragedy was no longer just an event in the African bush. It was a headline. The first statement came quickly, and it was cold. "We regret to confirm the passing of Mr. Richard Hale during a hunting incident. Out of respect for his family, no further details will be shared at this time." That was it. No mention of the buffalo. No acknowledgement of the violence, the chaos, the final scream. Just a sanitized line, neat enough for a press release. But silence has a way of creating noise. Within hours, the story spread across social media. Some reacted with sorrow, others with fury. Animal rights groups pounced on the news, calling it proof of what they'd warned for years. That trophy hunting isn't sport, but arrogance dressed up as tradition. One post read, "He hunted death until death hunted him back." Harsh words, but thousands of strangers shared them, liked them, turned them viral. Yet just as many voices rose in defense. Hunters, outfitters, and conservationists pushed back, arguing that without trophy hunting, there would be no money to fund anti-poaching patrols, no salaries for rangers, no incentives to preserve vast tracts of wilderness. To them, Richard's death wasn't justice. It was tragedy, a reminder that hunting is never safe, even for the most experienced. And in the middle of this global shouting match was Richard's family. His teenage daughter, his ex-wife, his brother. They weren't debating philosophy. They were staring into the void of loss. For them, this wasn't about conservation or cruelty. It was about an empty seat at the dinner table. It was about a voice they would never hear again. Some witnesses say his daughter had begged him not to go on this trip, that she'd feared exactly this. And now, her worst nightmare had walked out of the shadows, horns lowered, unstoppable. Investigators arrived, taking statements, combing through details. Was the group too close? Should backup rifles have been drawn sooner? Did someone miscalculate? Or was this the inevitable, the moment every hunter secretly fears? And then came the darker, whispered question. Was the buffalo killed afterward in retaliation? Some say yes, tracked down by nightfall to erase the stain of failure. Others insist no, that it still roams Hwange, a living shadow of the story that ended Richard's life. No one agrees. Maybe no one ever will. But one thing is certain. The silence after the storm was deafening. And that silence carried across oceans, into living rooms, onto phone screens, into debates that cut deeper than anyone expected. Because this wasn't just about a man and a buffalo anymore. It was about power, about risk, about who really controls the wild. And with Richard's story, the question became impossible to ignore. When the hunter becomes the hunted, who truly walks away? In Africa, stories don't just end, they echo. Long after the horns, the dust, and the silence, the questions remain. Richard Hale's death became more than a headline. It became a mirror, forcing us to ask what it really means to step into nature's arena. For some, his legacy is clear. He was a man who lived boldly, chasing risk the way others chase comfort. He built wealth, sought adventure, and refused to live halfway. That spirit, reckless or courageous, depending on who you ask, was undeniably part of who he was. And maybe that's what drew him to Africa in the first place. The idea that in the wilderness, stripped of modern safety nets, you find out who you really are. But for others, his story is a warning. That arrogance against the wild is always punished. That no matter how strong, how skilled, or how wealthy a person is, there are forces we cannot bend to our will. The buffalo didn't care about his business empire. It didn't care about his reputation. It didn't care about legacy. In the bush, all that mattered was survival. And in that contest, the wild never compromises. And yet, here's the deeper truth. Richard's story isn't just about hunting. It's about risk. Every generation faces its own buffalo. For some, it's an untamed animal in the African grasslands. For others, it's the risks of ambition, love, identity, or the future. We all step into tall grass at some point, not knowing if we'll walk back out the same. That's why this story resonates so fiercely with people your age. Because between 22 and 27, life feels like that wilderness. You're building careers, chasing passions, testing limits. Some of you want adventure, others security, but all of you are asking the same haunting question Richard faced. What price am I willing to pay to live the life I want? And here's the sobering contrast. Richard believed the risk was worth it, but the wild decided otherwise. That doesn't mean risk is the enemy. It means risk is real. Every choice you make, every leap, every hunt, every dream, carries the possibility of failure, loss, or even tragedy. But does that mean we stop chasing? Do we hide behind fences and walls, never testing ourselves against the unknown? Or do we step forward anyway, eyes open, heart steady, knowing that the very thing that makes life dangerous is also what makes it meaningful? Richard Hale's final hunt is a reminder, not a rule. A reminder that control is often an illusion. A reminder that arrogance in the face of nature, or in the face of life itself, has consequences. But also a reminder that living without risk isn't really living at all. So the legacy is not just in how he died, but in the questions he left behind for us to wrestle with. Who really controls the wild? Who decides when the hunter becomes the hunted? And when your moment comes, when you step into your own tall grass, will you be ready? That's the truth of the story. Not a simple tragedy. Not just a cautionary tale, but a challenge, a mirror. Because in the wild heart of life, there are no guarantees. The only certainty is this: the wild always decides. If this story made you stop and think, if it reminded you that the line between control and chaos is razor thin, then you'll want to stay with us. Hit subscribe right now, tap the bell, and join a community that isn't afraid to face the wild and the questions it forces us to ask.